I told my daughter I had 6 months to live on a Thursday evening in March. Not with a doctor in the room, not with test results spread across the table, just me and her, and the sound of the dishwasher running in the next room. I told her the way you tell someone something that has already finished rearranging itself inside you, quiet and settled. I said, Rachel, I went to see Dr. Osei on Monday. It's pancreatic. He gave me 6 months, maybe 8, if I respond well to treatment. I watched her face. My 41-year-old daughter, who I had carried on my shoulders through the Ohio State Fair 30-some years ago, who had called me every single Sunday since her mother passed, sat across from me and said 4 words before she could catch them. She said, "So the house sells." Not, "Dad, no." Not a single question about the treatment, the timeline, how I was feeling. "So the house sells." Then she caught herself, and her face rearranged into something that resembled grief. And she said she was in shock, that she didn't mean it like that of course we'd figure out the medical side first. The house was the last thing on her mind. She talked for almost 3 minutes walking that sentence backward. But I had already heard it. 4 words, clean and immediate. The sound of someone who had been doing math in the back of her mind for longer than she'd admit. Math that had just been handed its answer. I did not have 6 months to live. I did not have pancreatic cancer. Doctor Osei was a real doctor and a real friend, and he had done me a real favor. I had been testing my daughter, and she had answered a question I hadn't technically asked, in the 1 second before she remembered she was supposed to grieve. What I found in her car 3 days later was worse than the 4 words. Worse in a way I am still learning the size of. Hey there, family. If you're just finding your way to this channel, I'm glad you're here. And if you've been with me a while, you know I don't come to you with anything that isn't true. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, and let's get into this one. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 68 years old and I live outside Erie, Pennsylvania, in a stone farmhouse on 11 acres that's been in my late wife's family since her grandfather built it in 1947. I taught high school shop class for 31 years, and on the side I restored old farm equipment, mostly tractors, mostly for men whose fathers had owned the machine before them and wanted it running again for reasons that had nothing to do with farming anymore. My wife, Carol, died 5 years ago this coming October. Ovarian cancer, the slow kind, 18 months from the first appointment to the funeral, which sounds like a mercy compared to some but did not feel like one while we were living inside it. Carol kept our books, kept our calendar, kept track of which of our 2 kids needed which kind of attention on which week, and when she was gone I discovered how much of the family had been quietly running through her hands the whole time. I have 2 children. Rachel is my older, 41, lives 20 minutes away in Fairview, works as a regional sales director for a medical device company, a job that has made her sharp and quick and very good at reading a room before the room knows what it wants. She has her mother's laugh, which is one of the reasons it took me longer than it should have to see the rest of her clearly. My younger, Thomas, is 36, lives out in Pittsburgh, works as a paramedic supervisor, calls me every Sunday night at exactly 7 o'clock, because he set that schedule the year his mother got sick and never once let it slide. Not even the week his second daughter was born. When he called from the hospital hallway at 7:04 and apologized for being 4 minutes late. Thomas did not know about any of this. Nobody knew. Not my accountant, not my attorney, not Dr. Osei's nurse, not my late wife's brother Gene, who I eventually told but only after every piece of it was already finished and filed. I built this alone, over about 6 weeks in the dead of winter, because something had been collecting in me slowly enough that I hadn't named it yet, and I needed to know if it was real before I did anything about it. It started small, the way these things always seem to. Rachel had started asking, in the casual voice people use when they want an answer without asking a real question, whether I'd thought about simplifying, whether the farmhouse was a lot for one person on 11 acres, whether I'd had it appraised recently, just out of curiosity, just so I'd know what I was sitting on. She asked about Carol's life insurance payout, whether I'd invested it or just left it sitting, phrased like she was worried about me losing value to inflation. And Thomas mentioned, without thinking much of it, that Rachel had called him a few months back to talk about getting ahead of things with Dad, just so we're not caught off guard. Thomas hadn't found that strange. Thomas rarely found anything Rachel did strange, because Thomas had spent his whole life extending her the kind of trust you extend to someone who got there first, and therefore must know something you don't. It's a generosity Rachel had been spending for 30 years without ever once making a deposit back into it. I found it strange. I found the pattern of it strange, The way a man who has spent 3 decades diagnosing what's wrong with an engine by the sound it makes finds a pattern strange. Which is to say, I noticed it before I had words for it. And once I had the words, I couldn't put them back down. So I built the test. Dr. Osei owed me a favor from years back, when I'd rebuilt the engine on his father's old International Harvester for nothing but the parts cost, and he agreed to write me a single page on his letterhead, a plausible summary of a pancreatic diagnosis with a 6-month prognosis, real enough to hold up to a glance, fake enough that nobody's actual medical file would ever reflect it. It wasn't for showing anyone. It was so that when I sat across from my children, I'd have something solid enough in my head to be consistent. I called Rachel on a Tuesday and asked if she could come by Thursday for dinner, just the two of us, since Thomas was working a shift in Pittsburgh. She said of course, and she showed up 11 minutes early, which Rachel only ever did when she suspected something was coming. We ate meatloaf at the same table where she used to do her algebra homework, and when the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, I told her, pancreatic, 6 months, maybe 8. And she said, so the house sells. One sentence, unguarded, true. The 3 minutes of walking it back afterward told me almost more than the sentence itself, because I could watch her doing the work in real time, the recalculating, the folding of what she'd said into something that could pass for shock, the performance of concern arriving about 90 seconds too late to be believed. I have spent 31 years watching teenagers try to explain why a project wasn't finished, and I know exactly what it looks like when someone is building an explanation faster than the truth can catch up to them. We sat another hour after that. She was warm and helpful and full of questions about the doctors and the treatment options, all the things a daughter should ask, just delivered slightly out of order. She said she'd start looking into hospice resources, just to be prepared. She said we shouldn't rush any decisions about the house, but that it might be worth getting a realtor's opinion sometime soon, just so we knew the number. She said we. I told her I appreciated her coming. I walked her to her car. I stood on the porch and watched her taillights go down the gravel drive into the dark, and then I went inside, and I did not sleep much that night. I want you to sit for a second in the space between that Thursday night and the following Sunday, because that space is where this story stopped being about one careless sentence at a dinner table. I had thought the test was finished. I thought what I needed to know was whether the truth would slip out of her before she remembered to perform grief, and it had. And I believed I understood the whole shape of what I was looking at. I was wrong about the shape. Sunday showed me the rest of it. If you're still with me, hit that follow button, because what I found in my daughter's car 3 days later is the real reason I'm telling you this story tonight. Rachel came back out Sunday afternoon, said she wanted to help me start sorting through some of Carol's old paperwork before things get harder, which on its face was a kind thing to offer, and I let her, because I wanted to see what she did with the access. She'd parked in the drive, and around 4 o'clock she went out to her car to get a folder of what she called resources. Hospice brochures, she said, that she'd printed at the office. She left the driver's door open while she dug through her bag in the passenger seat, and I walked out behind her to bring her a coffee, the way I've walked out to that driveway 1,000 times, and I saw the folder sitting open on the passenger seat before she'd tucked the hospice pages back over it. It wasn't hospice brochures on top. It was a printed appraisal report from a realtor, dated 2 weeks before I'd ever told her about any diagnosis, listing our farmhouse and 11 acres at $410,000, with a handwritten note in the margin in Rachel's own handwriting that said, Thomas won't fight it if Dad's sick. Move fast. 2 weeks before I told her anything, she had been pricing my house before I gave her any reason to. I didn't say a word. I set the coffee down on the hood of her car, quiet, and I went back inside and sat down at Carol's old desk in the study, and I felt something in the center of my chest go very still. The particular stillness that comes when a thing you suspected but hadn't proven finally has a date stamped on it, a piece of paper, a motive with a timeline attached. The word for it wasn't complicated. It was betrayal, the plain domestic kind, not a movie villain's kind, just a grown daughter who had looked at her aging, grieving father and seen a closing window, and had started measuring the frame before anyone told her the window existed. I stood at that desk until I heard her come back inside, calling my name, asking where I'd gotten to, her voice bright and normal, a woman who believed she had just had a very productive Sunday. I said I was fine, just tired, and I told her I thought I should turn in early. She left around 6. I sat up until nearly midnight at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind Carol used to keep the household accounts in, and I wrote down everything, in order, The questions over the past year, the 6 words at dinner, the appraisal, the note in the margin, the date on it. Then I picked up the phone, and I did not call my attorney first. I called Thomas. It was a Sunday night, which meant it was his regular call time anyway. But I called 2 hours early, and he picked up on the first ring and said, "Dad, what's wrong?" before I'd said a single word, because 36 years of Sunday calls teaches a son what his father's silence sounds like. I told him everything. The fake diagnosis, the dinner, the 4 words, the folder in the car, the note in the margin. Thomas went quiet for a long time, the particular quiet of a man rearranging 30 years of assumptions about his sister into a shape he doesn't want. 410,000, he finally said. "Dad, what's the house actually worth?" I told him I didn't know exactly, that it hadn't been appraised independently, only by whoever Rachel had brought out there. Thomas exhaled slow. "She told me last spring you'd mentioned being worried about money since Mom's medical bills," he said. "She said you were quietly stressed about it, that we should be gentle with you about any big decisions." Last spring, before any of this, before I'd said a diagnosed word to anyone, Rachel had already been laying groundwork with her brother. A soft, patient story calibrated to make whatever came next look reasonable to both of us at once. A father who believed the house was a burden, and a brother who believed the same, so that when she arrived with a number, neither of us would think to ask anyone else first. Thomas said, "What do you need from me?" I said I needed the name of a good estate attorney in Erie, and I needed him to sit tight and say nothing to Rachel for now. He had a name inside 30 seconds. A woman named Patricia Alvarez who'd handled the estate for a paramedic buddy of his whose father had passed the year before, and I called her office first thing Monday morning. She listened without interrupting while I laid it all out, and when I finished, she asked me one question before anything else. "Mr. Kessler, do you have that appraisal document, the one with the handwriting on it?" I told her I did. I'd taken a photograph of it on my phone before Rachel ever noticed I'd seen it. "Good," she said. "That, combined with a documented account of the dinner conversation, gives us something real to work from, even without a recording of anything. What I want to do first is get an independent appraisal on record, something that reflects the actual market value, not whatever figure your daughter's realtor handed her. Then we revise your estate documents to reflect the truth of where things actually stand, before she takes any further steps, because based on what you've described, she is not moving slowly." I asked her how soon she could see me. "Tomorrow, 9 sharp, she said. I was there at 8:40. Patricia Alvarez turned out to be exactly what her phone voice promised. Precise, unhurried, working with the calm of someone who had walked this exact road with other families more times than she could probably count anymore. She had me lay out the whole timeline twice while she wrote in small, even handwriting on a yellow pad. And when I finished the second time, she flipped to a fresh page and started a list. The photograph of the appraisal, my accountant's full picture of my assets, my current will, and a dated, signed written account of the dinner conversation, as close to word for word as I could manage. I asked her how much weight my written memory would carry without a recording. Combined with the appraisal and the timeline, plenty, she said. "You're not filing a police report here, Mr. Kessler. Not yet, anyway. You're documenting your actual financial reality and correcting your estate to reflect your actual wishes. The dinner conversation supports the picture. It isn't the whole picture. The numbers are the whole picture. And the numbers, once she had them in front of her by that afternoon, were substantial. Carol's life insurance, which I had never touched, sitting at $320,000 in a conservative fund that had grown steadily since I'd stopped needing to think about it. My teacher's pension, fully vested after 31 years. My own savings and a modest but real business restoring and reselling antique tractors, which over 2 decades had quietly become worth more than either of my kids seemed to realize. The farmhouse and 11 acres, independently appraised that same week at $580,000, $170,000, above the number Rachel had already written on a note that said "move fast." Total picture, just over $1.1 million, held by a man his daughter believed was a few sick months away from needing to unload his house at a discount to whoever she brought to the table first. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because I sat with it for longer than a second myself. $170,000 of daylight between the truth and what Rachel had already decided to move on a father she believed was dying, based on a lie she had absolutely no reason to doubt. Patricia revised my documents over the following 4 days, and I want to tell you plainly what changed and what didn't, because both halves of it matter. Thomas's share did not change $1. He had earned every bit of it honestly across 36 years of Sunday phone calls and showing up, and nothing I'd learned that week altered a single honest fact about my younger son. Rachel's position changed, not to nothing, because I am not in the business of erasing a daughter, but to something accurate. Her inheritance was restructured to reflect what she had already received across her adult life. Help with a down payment years back that had never been mentioned since. Tuition for a graduate program she'd never finished. Money that had gone out quietly and never come back. And it left her something. But not what she had already priced and dated in the margin of a folder. The farmhouse itself went into a trust, with Patricia as an independent trustee, unable to be sold without her written approval, and a fresh independent appraisal inside any 60-day window, and no family member permitted to serve as buyer, agent, or intermediary on any sale of that property. Full stop. No exceptions. The language airtight because Patricia made certain of it herself. Thomas was named co-trustee. I called him the evening the papers were signed and filed, and he was quiet a moment before he said, "Dad, you didn't have to do all that." I told him that was exactly why it mattered. He laughed, short and real, the sound of a man recognizing a sentence in a slightly different shape than he'd heard it before. On Saturday morning, 5 days after the dinner where I'd told my daughter I was dying and she'd told me the house would sell, I called Rachel and asked if she could come by that afternoon. She said, of course. She'd been thinking about me all week, and she was there within 20 minutes of when I asked, which told me she'd been sitting closer to ready than she wanted me to know. I made coffee. I set it down in front of her, at the same table, and then I said, "Rachel, before I tell you anything else, I want you to hear something true. I love you. That doesn't change no matter what I say in the next 5 minutes, and I need you to hear it first so everything after makes sense inside that." Something moved through her face, small and involuntary, the first flicker of understanding that this wasn't the conversation she'd walked in expecting. "I don't have pancreatic cancer. I don't have pancreatic cancer," I said. "Doctor, Osei did me a favor and wrote up a document that isn't real. There is no 6 months. I am not sick." Silence, long enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum. "I needed to know something," I said, "and you told me before you had time to decide what you wanted me to hear. 4 words, Rachel, so the house sells. That's what came out of you before anything else did." She put both hands flat on the table and didn't say anything for a while. "And Sunday," I said. "When you left your car door open and went digging in your bag, I saw the appraisal sitting on top before you covered it back over. $410,000, dated 2 weeks before I ever told you I was sick. With a note in your own handwriting that said, 'Thomas won't fight it if Dad's sick. Move fast.'" The color went out of her face in a way I recognized from 31 years of watching students realize a story they'd told wasn't going to survive contact with the facts. "Dad," she said, "the market's not what you think it is out there right now. I was just trying to—" "The house is worth $580,000, I said. "I have an independent appraisal from this week to prove it. You had it priced $170,000 under that, ready to move the second I gave you an opening." She didn't try to argue the number. I'll give her that much. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the coffee and didn't build a version of events where what I'd just said wasn't true. And that told me something I hadn't been sure of until that exact moment, that somewhere underneath all the calculating, there was still a person who recognized when the calculating was finished. "The estate's been revised and filed," I said. "Patricia Alvarez on State Street handled it. The house is in a trust now. It can't be sold the way you were planning, not to you, not through anyone you bring to it." I paused. "Thomas is named co-trustee." She closed her eyes. "Does he know?" she said, "about the folder?" "He knows everything," I said. "The dinner, the note in your handwriting, all of it." A long silence stretched out between us, the kind with real weight sitting inside it. "Rachel," I said, "I'm going to ask you what I asked myself all week. Are you in some kind of trouble? Because a woman who has what you have doesn't price her father's house before he's even sick, unless something is already pressing on her." Her eyes filled up. "And for once I didn't think it was performance." "Yes," she said, so quiet I almost missed it. "Tell me," I said, and slowly, in pieces, with false starts and long pauses where she lost her nerve and had to find it again, she did. "A business investment 2 years back that a friend from her old job had pulled her into Solar panel financing that had collapsed when the company behind it turned out to be built on very little money she'd put in that she couldn't easily explain to anyone, including her own husband, a second, smaller loan taken out privately to cover the first hole, and a due date on that second loan that was closing in faster than she had a plan for. She wasn't dying of any disease. She was drowning in a debt she'd told no one about, and somewhere in the middle of that drowning, my house had started to look less like a home and more like a life raft she was entitled to. I let her get all the way through it without interrupting. When she finished, I sat with it a moment before I spoke. "You should have called me," I said. She looked down at the table. "Not to take something," I said. "To ask for something. There's a version of this where you called me 8 months ago and said, 'Dad, I made a mistake, and I'm scared,' and we'd have had a very different 8 months than the one we just lived through." I paused. "I don't know yet if I'd have been able to fix it. I want to be honest about that. What you were willing to do to get there, that tells me something about where your judgment's been living lately, and I'm still sitting with that part. But I'd have listened. We'd have had the conversation." Rachel put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and when she took it away, she said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And for the first time all week I believed the whole sentence, and not just the shape of it. "I know you are," I said. "The trust," she said. "What you changed. It's accurate," I said. "It reflects things as they actually are. If that changes over the coming years, I'll revisit it. Because I'm not trying to punish you, Rachel. I'm trying to be honest. But honest starts today, with the whole truth. And the whole truth is that what you were building toward wasn't the plan of a daughter who trusted her father to help her if she just asked." She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Where do I even start?" she said. "With your own lawyer," I said. "Tomorrow, before anything else, and you tell them everything, not the version that makes you look careful." She nodded again. "And then you call your brother?" I said. "Not me calling to tell him what you did. You call him yourself." She was quiet a moment, then said, "He's going to be so angry with me." "He is," I said. "And then he's going to listen. Because Thomas has always been better at both of those than either one of us gave him credit for growing up." She left around 5:30. I stood on the porch and watched her car go back down the gravel drive into the evening, and I stayed out there a while after the taillights disappeared, looking at the 11 acres. The old maple Carol's grandfather had planted the year the house went up, huge now in the way trees get huge while you're busy paying attention to other things. I called Thomas. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him how she'd looked, leaving, like someone who had set down something heavy and wasn't sure yet what to do with her hands now that they were empty. He made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh, and said that sounded exactly like her. We talked another half hour about nothing important, his girls, a new ambulance bay they were building at his station, the maple tree, which he hadn't seen since Christmas and which I told him was getting completely out of hand in the specific way maples do when nobody's stopping them. When we hung up, I went and sat in Carol's chair on the back porch, the one she used to take her coffee in every evening before she got sick, and I looked out at the acres and the fence line and the tree, and I breathed for a while. The house was still mine. The documents were accurate. The number Rachel had already written down would never appear on any offer, because the trust made that whole conversation impossible now. And 20 minutes away in Fairview, my daughter was sitting with whatever she was going to do with what she'd finally put down. I didn't know what came next for her. That part belonged to her and her attorney and her marriage, and the actual truth of her finances, once the managed version of it was finally out of the way for good. I'd told her plainly what I could live with and what I couldn't. The rest was hers to carry. What I understood, sitting in Carol's chair with the last of the daylight going orange over the fence line, was that the test had cost me more than I'd expected, not in dollars, but in the particular way that clarity always costs more than the comfortable version of not knowing, because not knowing lets you keep loving the daughter you'd prefer to have, and clarity makes you sit with the one who's actually yours. Rachel had failed the test in that kitchen on Thursday night, and then on Saturday afternoon she'd done something the test was never built to measure, which was tell me the truth when the truth was the only thing left in the room, without managing it, without softening it into something easier to hear. That wasn't nothing. It wasn't forgiveness either, not yet. But it wasn't nothing. I went inside and watered Carol's plants on the windowsill the way I do every evening, and I made myself dinner and sat down to eat it at the table instead of standing at the counter, which I don't always bother to do anymore. And I thought about my wife, who ran this family's whole quiet accounting for 30-some years with a patience I never fully learned to match, and who I suspect would have seen straight through to the bottom of this before I ever built a single false document to get there. She'd have done it her way, less architecture, more just sitting Rachel down and asking her straight out what was wrong. She'd probably have gotten there faster than I did. But she wasn't here to ask, and I did it the way I know how to do things, which is to build something solid, make sure it holds, and write down exactly what's true so nobody can argue with it later. It held. That was enough for 1 week. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, because we've got more of these coming every week. And if you've ever wondered what's really sitting underneath someone who's suddenly very interested in your finances, I'll tell you what a shop teacher from Erie, Pennsylvania learned in his own kitchen this past March. You don't need a hidden camera and you don't need a confession. You just need to give someone a reason to stop thinking, even for 1 second, and the truth will walk itself right out into the open before they remember they were supposed to keep it in.